everybody, welcome back to Anna Reads and A Disney Bound a Day. In case you haven't noticed, this isn't exactly a Bambi Disney bound, but we're gonna call it Little April Showers, okay? I don't actually own much in the way of brown wardrobes, so I just did a little bit of Bambi makeup, and this little guy is actually from the parks in the 90s, so we're just gonna have that count, okay? And Luther's all the way over there. He's sore at me for bringing a plushie into this. So, I crack open my ginger ale here. Got my plushie, got my Disney bound, got my cat, and let's jump right back into Walt Disney, An American Original by Bob Thomas. Where were we? I believe we were in Unit 1, Chapter 4. Right. From the October 1917 issue of The Voice, magazine of McKinley High School, Chicago, block quote. The freshmen are determined to make a great success this year, and from the early results, we may conclude that their boasts and determination have not been asserted in vain. They are already taking part in the vim and excitement of high school life. Walter Disney, one of the newcomers, has displayed unusual artistic talent and has become a voice cartoonist. Walt at last was getting his cartoons published. They were facile and humorous and reflected his own impatience to join the war effort. Roy had enlisted in the Navy, and Walt was envious when his older brother came home from the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in his sailor's uniform. Walt had grown as tall as Roy, but he was still too young to enlist. He inscribed his cartoons for The Voice with slogans such as, "Your summer vacation, work or fight," and "Buy war saving stamps, save and serve." One of his cartoons showed two slackers scoffing at a doughboy. "Wounded, hey? Well, that is too bad," while a pair of policemen threatened, "We'll nab those loafers while the soldier leaves them." We're still out of Coca-Cola. Walt also served as photographer for The Voice, and he studied anatomy, pen technique, and cartooning 3 nights a week at the Chicago Institute of Art. Among his teachers were Carrie Orr, cartoonist for the Chicago Tribune, and Leroy Gossett of the Herald. And Walt was permitted to visit them at the newspaper offices. He worked long hours over drawings in his room, never revealing a project until he completed it. He began assembling a gag file. He sat for hours in vaudeville houses, scribbling down jokes for cartoons. He also copied gags from burlesque comedians at the Haymarket and the Star and Garter. Speaking of burlesque life, this skirt has pockets, and so when I put my hand in my pocket this morning, I found 2 sticky dollar bills and they were attached to my good pair of pasties. Oh, by the way, I'm a burlesque performer. Don't like it? Scram. But yeah, hashtag burlesque life, dollar bills stuck to my good pasties in a random pocket. What can you do? This was a time when burlesque offered family entertainment, not the bawdiness of a later era. I'm sure he would be shocked by the scene in The Great Mouse Detective, and if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Walt compiled the jokes and tried out the best ones on his father. Elias listened to them without a smile. 2 days later, he would remark straight-faced to his son, "You know, I've been thinking about that joke you told me, Walter. It's funny, very funny." Elias Disney could not understand his son's fascination with the entertainment world, nor did he sympathize with Walt's ambition to be a cartoonist. But he agreed to pay for the boys' correspondence courses in art, as long as Walt contributed to the family income. Walt worked as handyman in the jelly factory, washing jars and capping them, mashing apples for pectin, nailing up boxes. One night he served as night watchman, patrolling the factory with a .38 caliber revolver and flashlight. "If you turn my ginger ale over, Cat." Oh, he's sore at me for having a plushie in the picture. Yes, yes, yes. Over here. Be cute for the camera. Come on. Right. Oh, for heaven's sake. .38 caliber. He turned on all the lights and kept the gun in his hand so burglars would know he was armed. The jelly factory paid him only $7 a week, and Walt quit to work as a guard and gateman on the Wilson Avenue elevated railway line at 40 cents an hour. Each afternoon, Walt donned his cap and badge and rode the elevated to the terminus in Chicago. If too many gatemen appeared for work, Walt returned home. Usually he was assigned to the rear gate, where he loaded a car with commuters, then rang the bell twice to signal the motorman to leave the station. When Walt finished his freshman year at McKinley High School in the spring of 1918, he and a friend applied for summer jobs at the post office. The friend lied about his age and was hired, but Walt admitted that he was 16 and turned away. He went home and penciled a few lines on his face, borrowed his father's suit and hat, and returned to the same employment window, declaring he was 18. He was hired. Walt worked from 12 to 14 hours a day, sorting the mail and making special deliveries throughout the city, riding free on streetcars and elevateds. One day, the supervisor asked Walt if he could drive a truck. "Sure," he replied. He had once driven a 2-cylinder Buick in Kansas City. I'm sorry, that reminds me so much of the scene in Good Burger where the manager asks Dexter, "Do you know how to drive a motor vehicle?" "Yes, I'm an excellent driver." "Any accidents on your record?" "Not to your knowledge." Walt, he was assigned to a white truck with 4 speeds forward and 4 reverse. Walt lurched through the Chicago streets on his deliveries, but by the time he returned to the garage, he had mastered the truck. On Sundays, he rode the streetcar to the end of the Grand Avenue Pier and collected the mail, mostly postcards from vacationers to the folks back home. Then he took the streetcar to the post office stables, harnessed a horse, hitched it to a mail wagon, and set out to pick up letters at boxes in the front of the downtown hotels. The supervisor warned him, "Now, kid, leave that horse alone. He knows every box and he knows his way back to the barn. Just keep your hands off the reins." It was hard to avoid the reins, especially when automobiles sped past the wagon. But the horse seemed to know what to do. At the Rush Street Bridge, which rose to allow boats to pass on the river, the horse came to a stop with its chest touching the chain. It waited stolidly for the bridge to lower, then proceeded across. Walt didn't need a route list. The horse halted beside every mailbox, and Walt jumped down to gather the letters. As soon as he slammed the tailgate of the wagon, the horse began walking forward, and Walt had to run to catch up, stepping on the wheel hub to climb aboard. He realized that the slam was the horse's signal to start, so he learned to ease the tailgate shut, then climb on the wagon and say, "Go on." My own dog thinks the words "go on" mean take off like a shot. The system worked perfectly until Walt reached a big hotel in the downtown loop. He went inside the lobby to collect the letters, and when he returned to the street, the horse was gone. Walt was in a panic. A horse with a wagon full of mail had disappeared in the busy downtown streets, and he was responsible. He ran to the corners and peered down each block, but there was no sign of the horse. He returned disconsolately to the hotel entrance, then looked through the passageway to the next street. The horse was waiting patiently on the other side. Its routine was to proceed around the block and wait for the mailman to pass through to the other side of the hotel. I wish someone remembered that horse's name, because God only knows he deserves it. One day, Walt was sorting letters with his fellow mailmen and joking about how the postal inspectors spied through the holes in the walls. He noticed that the other two men fell silent, and he turned around to find two uniformed inspectors standing behind him. "Disney, come with us," one of them said. He followed the two inspectors down a long corridor as hundreds of mail sorters watched. The two men took Walt to an office and began their interrogation. "2 Sundays ago, you picked up a bag of mail at the Grand Avenue Pier. What did you do with it?" "No, you didn't," he said. "I took it to the post office and put it down the chute." "No, you didn't." "The mail never reached the post office. Tell us what you did with it." Walt was certain that he had deposited the mail as usual. Finally, one of the inspectors said, "We'll tell you what you did with the mail. You hung it on a peg at the stable, and it's been there for 2 weeks. Now be more careful and get back to work." I have my own commentary about surveillance at work, but let's not frighten him, shall we? The summer of 1918 was the best that Walt had known. His hours from the post office were long, but there was no drudgery to the work, and he was outdoors most of the time. At night, he took girls from McKinley High School to movies and vaudeville shows. For the first time in his life, Walt had enough money to indulge himself, and he contemplated buying a movie camera or a canoe. A girlfriend urged him to buy a canoe, but he decided on the camera. He mounted it on a tripod in an alley and photographed himself in imitations of Charlie Chaplin. To please his friend, he joined another boy in buying an inexpensive canoe. It was so small and unwieldy that he and the girl were swept out into the lake on a windy Sunday. By late summer, the Allies had stopped the Germans in the Second Battle of the Marne, and Marshal Foch had ordered a counterattack. Walt grew more impatient to get in uniform, telling his parents, "I don't want my grandchildren asking me, 'Why weren't you in the war? Were you a slacker?'" The Navy had transferred Roy to Charleston, South Carolina, beautiful city by the way, then assigned him to voyages between New York and France. Ray Disney had joined the Army. Walt wanted to take part in the same adventure. He couldn't conceive of returning to high school for another year. A friend at the post office, Russell Maas, shared his feelings. They decided to cross the border and enlist in the Canadian Army, which accepted younger recruits. Their plot was thwarted when Russell's mother discovered his packed suitcase. Her son admitted the plan, and she warned Flora Disney. One day, Russell arrived at the post office and told Walt excitedly, "There's something forming here that you and I can get into. It's a volunteer group called the American Ambulance Corps, part of the Red Cross. They need drivers, and they're not fussy about how old you are." Can you just imagine that? Ambulance drivers, and they're not fussy about how old you are. At noon, the two young men hurried to the headquarters of the American Red Cross. They learned the age limit for ambulance unit volunteers was 17. Both were 16, but they falsified their ages and signed up as the St. John brothers, Russell and Walter. The ruse succeeded until the applications for passports, which required their parents' signatures. Walt was forced to disclose his plan to his parents. "I will not sign any permission," Elias Disney declared. "It's signing a death warrant for my son." Flora Disney argued that 3 of their sons had left the family home by stealth, and she didn't want Walter to go the same way. "The boy is determined," she said. "I would rather sign this and know where he is than have him run off." "Well, you can sign it for me. I won't," Elias replied, and he stalked from the room. Flora forged his name on the passport application, and Walt altered his birth date to read 1900. He and Russell Maz returned to the Red Cross, and their applications were accepted. The boys received uniforms and reported to a tent encampment at a burned-down amusement park near the University of Chicago. Mechanics from the Yellow Cab Company taught them how to repair motors and drive cars over rough terrain. An influenza epidemic struck Chicago, and Walt became so sick that he was ordered to a hospital. The ambulance driver asked him, "You live in Chicago, kid?" When Walt said that he did, the driver suggested, "We better take you home. With this flu going on, you'd never come out of a hospital alive." Walt took the advice. 2 of his close friends had been taken to the hospital, and they had died the next day. Flora Disney nursed her son through days of high fever and delirium, giving him poultices and heavy doses of quinine. I shall hold my commentary until the end, shall I? Because his bedroom had no heat, Walt occupied his parents' room. When little Ruth became ill, her bed was placed beside the kitchen stove. Flora herself caught the influenza, which was killing Chicagoans by the 100, but she continued caring for her 2 children. Finally, the fevers broke. Walt regained his strength and returned to the ambulance corps. He was dismayed to learn that his outfit, including Russell Maz, had shipped out. Walt was assigned to a new unit and sent to Sound Beach, Connecticut to await passage to France. November 11th, 1918 brought jubilation to the country, but the Red Cross volunteers at Sound Beach greeted the armistice with ambivalent feelings. The reason for their volunteering had gone, and they faced the future as peacetime chauffeurs. They called themselves Coxey's Army, after the ragtag band of unemployed who marched on Washington in 1894, and they grumbled about camp discipline, complaining that they were treated like draftees. Homesickness became endemic. Walt missed his mother's cooking, and he longed to see the girl who had promised to wait for his return. Early one morning, lights flashed on in the barracks, and the awakening volunteers heard a voice shout, "Up, everybody! Up, everybody! 50 guys going to France!" A bunkmate shook Walt and said, "Hey, Diz, wake up! They're shipping out 50 guys!" Walt replied groggily, "They won't pick me," and returned to sleep. The 50th name called was Walter E. Disney. His companions rolled him out of bed, and within an hour he was on the train to Hoboken. I've seen enough Looney Tunes to say, I'm sorry about that. That night, November 18th, remember that day, he embarked for France aboard a rusting cattle ship, the Vauban. I cannot do French at all, I'm sorry. The disappointment over the end of the war was now forgotten in the new adventure of crossing the Atlantic on a ship laden with ammunition. Although there was no reason to fear German U-boats, the ship had passed through waters that had been heavily mined. Disregarding the danger, Walt slept directly over the magazine hatch. As the ship approached France, minesweepers came alongside to provide an escort through the hazardous English Channel. The Red Cross volunteers lined the railing to watch the minesweepers, long booms on each side, patrol the waters, their guns scanning the surface for mines. At Cherbourg, huge anti-submarine nets parted to allow the Vauban to enter the port. The ship didn't land, but continued on to Le Havre, arriving December 4th. Walt disembarked with his shipmates, and the young Midwesterners toured the waterfront streets wonderingly. Few had been away from their own cities, and they were overwhelmed by the sights of the French seaport. They were astonished by the street corner urinals, and none could summon the nerve to use them. For more on street corner urinals, please see my previous video series, Unmentionable, the Victorian Lady's Guide to Sex, Marriage, and Manners by Teresa O'Neill. Seriously, we covered that. But after a day of sightseeing, one of the Americans could wait no longer. He stepped up cautiously to the pissoir, and his companions followed. I get the feeling many men would use a litter box if one were provided. Members of the American Ambulance Corps trooped to the railroad station for the trip to Paris. Walt was fascinated to see how small the French engines seemed in comparison to those he had known in his summer as a news butcher. He stared out the window on the journey through the French countryside, noticing the high hedges and the groves of poplars that separated the small farms. Paris still looked like a city at war. As he rode a taxi down the Champs-Élysées, he saw the sidewalks filled with men in uniform. Sandbags still protected the monuments of the Étoile, and gun carts rattled through the streets. Walt had only a brief tour of the city before reporting to the American Ambulance Corps headquarters at Saint-Cyr, site of the French Military Academy. Saint-Cyr was a disappointment after the enticements of Paris. The volunteers were billeted in a chateau so dank and chill that Walt wrapped himself in newspapers before going to sleep on his cot. The food was dismal, mostly pork and beans. When December 5th arrived, Walt faced a grim 17th birthday. Late in the afternoon, he stopped by the canteen and found only one friend there. "Come on over to the bistro and I'll buy you a grenadine," the friend said. The pair walked to the nearby cafe and discovered it was deserted. As soon as they closed the door, Walt's friends emerged from under tables and behind counters shouting, "Happy birthday, Diz!" All crowded to the bar and ordered grenadine, wine, and cognac. They slapped Walt on the back and downed their drink, leaving him to pay the bill. He emptied his money belt, but that was not enough. Walt had to sell his extra pair of Red Cross shoes for 30 francs. Some friends. Walt was transferred from Saint-Cyr to Evacuation Hospital 5 in Paris. First, he drove 5-ton trucks and ambulances converted into small cars by cutting off the back end. Oh, do you want up? Is that what you want? Be sweet. Oh. You pee on that, I swear. Then he was assigned to the motor pool, in reality a taxi service for Army officers. He soon learned the geography of Paris, driving majors and colonels to various headquarters, hospitals, legations, and on occasion, bordellos. Headquarters assigned Walt to drive a white truck loaded with beans and sugar to the devastated area of Soissons. He selected an assistant and set off through the Paris suburbs and into the French countryside. After he passed through a village, the motor started to clank. The noise grew louder, and the chassis vibrated with the pounding of the engine. Finally, with a great rattling sound, the engine halted, and Walt coasted around the corner, parking off the road and near a watchman's shack. Walt suspected that the truck had thrown a rod. No amount of tinkering would induce it to start again. He remembered the Red Cross driver's credo, "Never leave your vehicle." So he dispatched the assistant back to the village to ride a train to Paris and bring help. Walt resigned himself to a long wait in the February cold. He stayed in the cab for a few hours, but as night fell, his feet grew numb from the cold. In his hesitant French, he asked the railroad watchman if he could share the tiny shack. The watchman agreed, welcoming the young American's offer of the truck's emergency rations: bread, cheese, tinned beef, and chocolate. Walt dozed through the night in the 4 feet square shack, enjoying the warmth of a tiny stove, to which the watchman added a lump of coal every half hour. The next day brought no help from Paris, and Walt spent another night before the small stove. On the 3rd day he was so hungry and so numbingly tired that he walked to the village inn and ordered a meal and a bed. When the meal arrived, there was a cockroach among the lamb chops and peas. Walt merely pushed it off the plate, swallowed the food, and fell asleep on the bed. Okay, I can't think about that for any longer. He awoke in a panic, discovering that he had slept for 24 hours. He raced back to the railroad crossing and discovered to his horror that his truck was gone. He trudged back to the village, dreading the consequences when he returned to Paris. A freight train arrived, and the trainman allowed him to ride in the cupola on one of the cars. When Walt arrived at headquarters, he discovered what had happened. His assistant had enjoyed a 2-day drunk before reporting the breakdown. The disabled truck was towed back to Paris, its cargo intact. Disney faced serious charges of abandoning his truck. A friendly sergeant from Evacuation Hospital 5 appeared before a board of officers and argued that the young driver had done all that was physically possible by remaining near his truck for 2 nights. The board agreed, and no discipline was imposed. The errant assistant landed in the guardhouse. Surprised that's all he got. Americans continued leaving France in the post-war months, and little work remained for the Red Cross motor pool. Disney was reassigned to a canteen at Neufchâteau, near Nancy. During long hours of idleness, Walt got out his pad and pencil and began cartooning. He mailed cartoons to Life and Judge, America's 2 leading humor magazines. All were returned with polite, printed notices of rejection. Composing a letter to his high school magazine, he illustrated it with a self-portrait and impressions of soldiers and prisoners of war he had seen. He drew posters for the canteen and caricatures for the soldiers to send home, and he decorated the canvas top of his ambulance with an alluring female. I would pay money to see that picture. Borrowing a croix de guerre from a French officer, he painted a replica of the medal on his jacket. Others at the canteen admired it and paid him to do the same on their jackets. He teamed up with an enterprising Georgian who had established a souvenir industry. I am not surprised. The Georgian realized the desire of homeward-bound doughboys to collect mementos of war, especially those soldiers who had seen no combat. There is a whole episode of MASH about the buying and selling of war souvenirs. When the troop train stopped at Neufchâteau to change engines, he went down the aisle selling German helmets he had collected on battlefields. One day he noticed that Walt had painted his footlockers in camouflage colors. "Hey Diz, can you paint me a sniper's helmet?" asked the entrepreneur. Walt obliged, and he aged the helmets with quick-drying shellac, earning 5 francs apiece. The Georgian rubbed the helmets in the dirt, shot holes in them, attached hair to the jagged edges, and sold them on the troop trains at inflated prices. Way to make us proud, Georgia. Way to make us proud. Walt mailed the profits of his enterprises to his mother, along with half his monthly salary of $52. One day he entered a barracks crap game and emerged with $300. He hurried to the American Express office and dispatched the money to his mother with instructions to buy his sister Ruth a watch and bank the rest. A dozen years later, Walt reminisced about the days at Neufchâtel in a letter to Alice Howell, a Nebraska woman who operated the Red Cross canteen. Block quote. Just in case you can't place me, I will try to give you a brief outline of the work I did. I was the chauffeur of the canteen car. It was my duty to hang around the canteen all day and run errands. I used to drive the girls back and forth from the canteen to their quarters, take them into the country to buy eggs, drive them to the Army commissary for supplies, and occasionally on picnics. My main hangout was the little shanty attached to the canteen where the bread was cut. You will perhaps remember the time that General Pershing sent his son Warren to spend the day with you, and we all got into the little car I drove and went up to Domremy, Joan of Arc's birthplace, and had a wonderful picnic with fried chicken and all sorts of good things to eat. And boy, how good that fried chicken tasted. I remember some of the boys from the 2nd Cavalry who used to be around the canteen, and I remember the squad of German prisoners who worked in the shower rooms. I especially remember one of the prisoners whom I liked real well. I believe his name was Rupert. I remember how they used to play tricks on me to get me to buy things for them. One day Rupert came to me with an empty wine bottle in his hand and gave me some money, saying that Miss Howell wanted me to buy her some wine. Unsuspectingly, I carried out his orders, all the time wondering how it happened Miss Howell wanted me to buy her wine. When I returned, Rupert was waiting for me and insisted that he take the wine to you. I did not think any more about it until about half an hour later, when I went to the shower rooms. I found all the German prisoners having a great time on that bottle of wine. That was only one of the pranks Rupert and his gang played on me. When the prisoners went on work crews, Walt and Rupert sat in the canteen car and talked about the war and the future of Germany. They became good friends and helped each other in finding ways to relieve the daily tedium. One day, they drove to the outskirts of a village where prisoners loaded cordwood onto trucks. School children strolled by on their way from school. They had never seen German soldiers, and they started throwing rocks. Walt told Rupert, who spoke fluent French, to order the children to stop. They persisted, and on Walt's suggestion, the prisoners filled their pockets with rocks. When the school children ignored a second order to stop, Walt called, "Rupert, charge!" The prisoners loosed a fusillade of rocks and chased the children into the village. Little punks had it coming. Walt was assigned to chauffeur 2 dignitaries on a tour of the Rhine country, and before leaving he consulted the village priest on what to see. He gained a reputation as an expert guide, and he drove other visitors through France and Germany. On one trip he arrived in Strasbourg on July 14, 1918, to witness the first Bastille Day celebration in 50 years for the recaptured city. In August, the Neufchâtel canteen was disbanded, and Walt was transferred to Paris. He found the city changed. The uniforms were disappearing, and the tempo and attitudes of Parisians were returning to normal. Walt found that the American Ambulance Corps headquarters at Saint-Cyr had been shut down, and his friends in the organization had departed. The Red Cross issued a call for ambulance drivers for a war in Albania, and Walt was tempted by the salary of $150 a month, more than he had ever earned. Yes? Yes? Then he encountered Russell Maz, the Chicago boy with whom he had joined the Red Cross. They talked of home, and over French coffee and cognac, they concocted a scheme to build a raft and float down the Mississippi like a pair of Huck Finns. Both had bought German Shepherd puppies, and they agreed the dogs would join them on the voyage. Russell was returning to America immediately, and Walt paid $75 for his dog to go with Russell. The two young men from Chicago visited a photographic studio in Paris and posed for postcards to send to their friends and family back home. The two photographs afford a character study of the 17-year-old Walt Disney. In one, he appears in overseas cap, khaki uniform with jodhpurs and leggings, his heavy overcoat draped casually over his arm. He is bemused and proud. Then he posed in battle helmet, looking like the doughboy he wanted to be. He is grimly serious, dedicated, a traveler of the world. There can be no doubt what Walt intended the photographs to accomplish, to let those at home know that he had grown to manhood in France. On September 3, 1919, General Pershing and his staff departed from Paris, and other American units followed. The American Ambulance Corps was finally disbanded, and the remaining volunteers were dispatched to Marseille for passage home. When Walt Disney and his companions reached the dock, they found their ship floating high in the harbor. A dock strike prevented loading. The unit was ordered to Nice until the strike was solved, and for 3 weeks, Walt lived a splendid life at a Riviera resort. Then the strike ended, and Walt boarded the ship at Marseille for the voyage back to America and the start of his career. That has been Unit 1, Chapter 4 of Walt Disney, an American Original. And you've probably heard people comparing the COVID-19 pandemic to the Spanish flu that almost took Walt Disney from us before he could accomplish anything. What we have is a Venn diagram of similarities and differences, and right there in the center, between those two rings in the Venn diagram, that center says, we're going to get through this. The world continued to spin on after 1918. People put back together, people got up, and they made do again. And we're all going to do the same thing. I have to admit, like Dumbo, I haven't actually watched the film Bambi all the way through in decades, probably. But I would like to leave you with hope may die, yet love's beautiful music comes each day like the dawn. That's a snippet from the opening song of Bambi, Love is a Song. I'm struggling. I am. I know a bunch of y'all are too. And we're gonna get through this together. And when we all come out the other side, I better see each and every one of y'all at Walt Disney World. We're all gonna Disney bound together, right? Right. So, now it's time to say goodbye to all our company. M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y. Why? Because we like you, you grouch. M-I-C.